Hey nerds, Aradia here. If you've ever been confused about the art of cartomancy, stick around, because today we're talking tarot. Choosing a tarot deck can be a daunting task, especially if it's your first deck. But it doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be sacred. And it doesn't have to be the end of your tarot journey if you end up not liking the first deck that you picked. I have decks I've used for a short while and haven't touched in years, and that's okay. Today we're talking my 6 top tips for choosing the perfect tarot deck, whether it's your first or your 50th. Whether you fall in love at first sight or agonize for weeks over whether or not the deck is for you, these tips will not steer you wrong, I promise. I should note, everything we're about to talk about here is trumped by affordability. If you can't afford to buy a tarot deck, even if it checks every mark on this list, don't buy it. Your personal safety, financial security, and ability to eat is more important than buying the perfect tarot deck. Now with that out of the way, let's get started. Let's cut to the chase. The rest of these tips mean fuck all if you don't like the look of your deck. Aesthetics and art style are incredibly important when you're picking your first tarot deck because if you don't like the look of your cards, you're not going to want to read with them. And if you don't read with them, then why did you buy them in the first place? Now I say this and I start with this because it's the most important point, absolutely. But also because a lot of people are under this mistaken impression that when you're first starting with tarot, you have to buy the Rider-Waite-Smith deck because it's the traditional, it's the OG, it's the gold standard. And yes, but also no. The deck is great, but it's not for everybody. It's not for me. I don't own a copy of that deck. I don't want to own a copy of that deck because the art style just doesn't appeal to me. Art is designed to make the human brain react. It's designed to make us think. And if we don't like the art style and the aesthetic of a deck, it's not going to inspire us, which means our readings aren't going to be as accurate because it's not going to be awakening that intuition. If your intuition isn't involved when you're reading your tarot cards, it's not so much reading as it is rote memorization. And that's not divination, that's homework. The bottom line is if you don't like the look of a deck, you're not going to use the deck. And if you don't use the deck, you've just wasted your money. So don't feel shallow or vain because your first deck is one that draws your eye. It should be that way. This is probably honestly the only time in my life I'm going to tell you that looks are important, but looks are important when buying a tarot deck. Now, if you have a selection of decks that you know you are drawn to, that the art style appeals to you, what else should you be looking for at that point? Well, the next thing I look at, honestly, is containment. What kind of box or container does the deck come in? If you plan to use your cards only at home, keep them on your altar or your bookshelf, maybe draw a card or two in the morning, then you don't necessarily need a heavy-duty storage container or way of transporting your deck. But if you're anything like me, that deck is going to follow you around everywhere. The decks I'm currently using go in my messenger bag, they get stuffed into my bag of holding, they travel around with me everywhere I go, in case I need to pull a card while I'm out, or someone wants to see a deck that I have. That means that if it comes in a flimsy cardboard box, I'm going to have to think about what I'm going to put it into after I buy it, which means I'm going to need to buy something else. Now sometimes that's not a problem, and it doesn't have to be a problem. Having to find a different way to store your tarot deck is not necessarily a make or break factor when choosing a deck, but it is something to consider. Personally, even if I like the box that a deck comes in, I usually end up taking it out, wrapping it in cloth, and tucking it in a drawstring bag, because to me that's a bit more aesthetic as well. Don't lie. The image of somebody pulling out a worn drawstring bag, removing a fabric-wrapped parcel, and laying out well-loved cards on a tabletop is a lot more appealing than a battered cardboard box coming out of a bag. Bonus, if you're reading for clients, that gets them in the mood too. Not all decks are the same size, or even the same shape. And while this also doesn't have to be a deal breaker when picking a deck, it is definitely something that you should keep in mind. Because if a deck is too big for your hands, how are you going to read with it? How are you going to shuffle? Somebody with smaller hands may not be able to shuffle a deck very well. Or somebody with larger hands may feel like they're crumbling those mini decks in their palms. Playing cards have been the same standard size for ages, for a really good reason. They fit basically universally in everybody's hands. Standard tarot card sizes, however, are 2.75 by 4.75, which is slightly bigger than a standard playing card deck, which allows for more art and intricacy, but typically fits really well in the hand as well. However, some decks have tiny versions, some decks are really big, some decks are round. Now, if you really like a deck and you don't feel like it fits in your hands very well, you can just think of another way to shuffle them. Sometimes I like laying them out into piles and then mixing those piles together. It's very Magic the Gathering of me. Whether it matters to you a little bit or matters a lot, you should definitely figure out how much size matters. Again, things I never thought I would say. A key choice you're going to want to make before you buy your first tarot deck is whether or not you want a pip deck. Now, a pip deck is a style of deck where only the major arcana and the court cards have full illustrations. The regular minor arcana 1 through 10 just have the numerical representations of the suit on the card. So for example, the 5 of Cups would have 5 cups on the card and nothing else. Now, the alternative to a pip deck is a fully illustrated deck. So each of the 78 cards in that deck will have a full scene illustrated on the card to tell you what the card is meant to read as. Pip decks are interesting because they were the OG before we had the fully illustrated deck. And in fact, the fully illustrated deck wasn't made popular until the Rider-Waite-Smith deck was made popular. The major con to a pip deck is if you're new to interpreting the cards, there isn't really much in the way of art to interpret to help you figure out what the meanings are. That means you will have to go into reading that deck with a little bit more homework and prep work. Luckily, you don't necessarily need to memorize each of the 78 cards. You see, the 4 suits have specific meanings to each of those suits, and the numbers 1 through 10 have specific meanings, which means all cups generally deal with the same themes, and all 5s generally deal with the same themes. And when you're using a pip deck, as long as you remember those different meanings, you can typically mix and match on the fly and be able to figure out the meaning of a card. However, some people really like the fully illustrated scenes. It gives you a little bit more understanding of the meaning of that card without having to memorize on the fly, and so they find that they can read them better. Neither way is better than the other. In fact, I have a combination of both types of decks in my collection. What matters is how you think you're going to be comfortable reading, and focusing on that before you branch out into the other style. Pretty much every deck you come across is going to have some sort of theme. Some could be simple, like flowers or Star Wars, and some could be more in-depth, like environmentalism or pride. If you're pondering over a specific deck, you'll need to think about whether or not you resonate with that theme. Now, if you've fallen in love with the art style of a deck, but you don't necessarily respond to the theme very well, you can still use that deck. But you may not be as connected to it over time as you thought you would be, because the theme is what the creator is intending when they create the deck. And if that's not what you're reading, then you're missing half of the point of that deck. Connecting with the theme of the deck can help you connect with the energy of the deck a lot deeper and will result in more nuanced readings over time. The last thing I suggest people keep in mind when they're looking for a deck is not going to be for everybody. And I know that this may get me some hate in the comments, but I'm saying it anyway. Representation, accountability, and appropriation are really important to keep in mind when you're choosing your first deck, if you're choosing a deck in a mindful and responsible way. If you looked at tarot creators and publishers, you would think that only white people read tarot decks, and that's just not true. The amount of representation from people of color and the LGBTQ+ community in terms of creating decks is dismally small. In fact, I work with publishers and suppliers, and I've only seen one Pride deck. And some of the decks I've seen that feature people of color are not created by people of color. Now, you may not think that's a problem, and if you don't, okay, but I think it's incredibly important that creators of tarot decks aren't just churning out tarot decks to make money. It's a very mindful practice to read the deck, so it should be a mindful practice to create one too. I've seen Italian creators of Native American decks. I've seen white creators of black decks, and I've seen botanical decks that promote unethical herb use and wildcrafting. Now, I know that this tip may not matter to you, but honestly, I really think it should. The spiritual community is very white, and it's very cis heteronormative, and that's not representative of its community members. If we want to see more decks from queer creators and people of color, we need to be buying those decks and supporting them. And if we just buy the next white person deck off the shelf because we recognize the name, that's not showing that we think representation matters. And I don't know about you, but to me, representation matters. So that's my checklist of 6 things to keep in mind when you're choosing a tarot deck, especially if it's your first time. But at the end of the day, remember that it doesn't really matter, because you can always go buy a new deck. Not to encourage bad financial habits or anything, but I do own like 14. What do you think is the most important thing to keep in mind when you're buying a tarot deck? Is it one of my tips, or do you have one of your own? Leave them in the comments below. If you want to see me break down my likes and dislikes of the Botanica Tarot from Beehive Books, click the card or the link in the description. Friends, thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to this channel and click the bell so you receive notifications whenever I post a new video. If you want to check me out in the other places around the web, make sure to click the links down in the description. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and until next time, remember, you make your own magic. So go make it.